When artists talk, when military people talk, when writers talk, what do you think we talk about? We don't talk about the subject we're writing about. Hardly ever does that come up. The saying in the military is, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. I would say among professional writers, we never ask each other, what are you working on, except in the broadest possible sense. But we ask, what is it? What structurally? How are you making it work? What is your plan for, like an architect building a building? How does it lay out? And with Lance Morrow, who was a peerless essayist, I could talk to him about his crystalline perfection of a sentence, and he would talk to me about how do you write these big, long novels with big structural pillars that hold them up. And we never tired of talking shop, in a way. And so with my friend Janice Weber, I was talking shop about this Liszt piece, Valet Dobermann, and I said, why does Liszt double the third in the final chord of Valet Dobermann? Now that may sound like something of such minimal interest as to be barely worth talking about. But for pianists and musicians, it's all the difference in the world. And why do I bring this up? Because in classical harmony, that is to say from the time of Bach to the present, you have a chord that has a root, has a third, major or minor, and a fifth, and that's the chord. What you never do is double the third. So let's take, for example, E major, and the third in E major is G sharp. If you have a final chord, there's only going to be one G sharp in that chord, generally speaking. So you've got the bass E, B, E, and in the right hand, E, G sharp, B, E. But Liszt doubles the third. And he doubles the third right after a chord that doesn't resolve the tonality into E major, what you think he's going to do. Instead, he hits an augmented E chord, which is E, G sharp, C. And an augmented chord in classical music practice and theory is very destabilizing. It does not resolve anything. And after this long journey we have made with the composer and the pianist who's playing it, to have it end on such a note of uncertainty and compound the uncertainty with this double G sharp is something that pianists talk about all the time. Now, this piece was based on a very, very influential French novel from 1804, an epistolary novel called Obermann, written by Étienne Pivert de Senancourt, which followed another very influential epistolary novel, Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther, Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, and that came out in 1787. That book was famous for causing an epidemic of suicide among young men all over Europe. The story of a man who loses the woman he loves because she marries a rich guy and forsakes him. He shoots himself to death on Christmas Eve, just resonated with the young people of the turn of the 18th century into the 19th century, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So when Liszt decided to run off with another man's wife, which was not an unusual thing for Liszt, shall we say, he did it twice, and make her his mistress, and they traveled all over Europe together. He was, at that time, beginning his famous career as a piano virtuoso. She left her older French husband and their children, and they went off to Switzerland, and Liszt memorialized this in a series of piano pieces called the Années de Pèlerinage, Years of Pilgrimage, and the first book is Switzerland, Suisse. And Valet Dobermann is the centerpiece of this work. And Liszt, because he was a literary man, he attached some epigraphs to the score, and one of them was from Senancourt. Que veux-je? Que suis-je? Que demander à la nature? Who am I? What do I want? What am I asking from nature? And this is crucial. The 19th century, as we're going from the Rococo period of the 18th century, moving into the 19th century, especially in Germany, is a world of forests and mountains and natural beauty. They were the original ecologists. They found beauty in a stream, and they wrote poems about it, they wrote music about it, they wrote novels about it. It obsessed everybody. And the second epigraph that Liszt attached to this score was from the poet Lord Byron. But as it is, I live and die unheard, with a most voiceless thought, sheathing it as a sword. Now, this is all going to come together, so don't despair, I promise you. And we'll come back to Byron in a bit. But follow the bouncing ball. This is what I think I have made a kind of specialty of mine, cultural lineage from one event and person to another. And in this case, I would say Mozart, and you'll see why, the French Revolution, Without the Marriage of Figaro, which was a play by Beaumarchais, turned into an opera by Mozart, there is no French Revolution. The arts paved the way for the acceptability of criticizing the nobility, which is what Mozart does in his famous comic opera. But like everything Mozart does, it's not really funny. It's deadly serious. What is the result of the French Revolution? Napoleon. The French Revolution overthrew the monarchy and replaced it with an emperor. But along the way, Napoleon seized power, almost chickened out, but did, became the first consul of the post-revolutionary government in France, and then later crowned himself the Emperor of the French. Just at the time Napoleon has embarked on his conquest of Europe, the first 10 years of the 19th century, almost simultaneously, Beethoven writes the Eroica Symphony. The Eroica Symphony is twice as long as any symphony that has come before it. It is in 4 giant movements. It is in 3/4 time, the first movement, and it is in E-flat major. Why did he do that? Because, as we started this line with Mozart, Mozart's 39th Symphony is in E-flat major, and it is in 3/4 time. Very rare to have a first movement in a classical structure in 3/4 time. So Beethoven is clearly indicating the influence of Mozart. But in the size and the scope and the ambition, he is reflecting Napoleon. In fact, he dedicates the symphony to Napoleon. At the same time, Napoleon's guns are just outside of Vienna. And in fact, at some of the early performances of the Eroica Symphony, which is the third, Napoleon's troops are in the audience, listening to it. Beethoven triggered an outpouring of romanticism. He straddles the gap between the classical period and the romantic period. Napoleon and Beethoven are the same person for the purposes of this discussion. And who did Napoleon influence? Well, yes, he was a great general, and one of the chapters of this book is on his masterpiece at Austerlitz against the Russians and the Austrians. But he had a greater influence on the artists of his day. Why? Because Napoleon himself was a novelist. We forget this. He began as an aspiring young novelist. Now remember, this man is a complete outsider. He's not even French, for one thing. He doesn't even learn how to speak French very well, for another. He's a member of a very minor Italian family in Corsica, which at the time of his birth had just come under French suzerainty. But he makes his way in the world all by himself. And why I argue in this book, Napoleon is the first romantic. He is the first modern man. He's the first man to say, I can do this and I don't care what you think, and I will do it my way and you will like it, or you will lump it. And so that was just what the artists of the 19th century wanted to hear. We are free. We are free of the courts. Beethoven had to be aware of courtly patronage. So did Mozart. Not Liszt. He just came and he went, took other men's wives with him. He was the first professional concert pianist. He invented that career. But just before Liszt comes Byron, who adores Napoleon. And Byron, again, is one of these rare birds in Western history who does it his way. Everything about Byron, again, a minor noble family, but a profligate spender, a man of omnisexuality, I suppose we would say. When Byron was in town, no page boy or chambermaid was safe. Byron wrote a number of poems about Napoleon. After Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, Byron was inconsolable and bought, with somebody else's money, of course, a carriage that was the exact replica of what the emperor had taken to the Waterloo battlefield. Byron gives us the term Byronic. That is, someone dashing and handsome and strong and doesn't care what you think and is going to do it his way. And as you know, he died young. He had to leave England because his homosexuality or bisexuality would have brought him into severe legal trouble in England at that time. He traveled across Europe. He befriended Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe, who weren't married either, by the way, and in fact believed in complete free love. And one of my favorite Byron stories, as you all probably know, is that year, I think 1814, I forget exactly, was the year without a summer. There had been a volcanic eruption in the South Pacific, and there was no summer in Europe. It rained the whole time. But they had all met up at a villa in Geneva. And because the weather was so awful, they stayed inside having sex with each other and drinking absinthe and taking drugs and hallucinating. And one night they decided that they had to tell each other ghost stories. This is where Frankenstein comes from. This is where Dracula comes from, indirectly, from a Byron fragmented short story that was later developed by his own personal physician who was there, and then by Bram Stoker. So Byron's influence is radiating out in all directions, and Liszt picks that up. He's slightly younger. He's born in 1811. He's a prodigy, of course. He's run off with Marie, the Countess d'Agoult, in his 20s. They have 3 children, one of whom later went on to marry Richard Wagner. You almost can't make this up, the connections among these people. But Liszt thought of himself as a Byronic figure. He was dashing, he was extremely handsome. Women could not stop throwing themselves at him. He moved around Europe on his own recognizance. I mean, they would never ask him for his papers because they knew who it was. He was that famous and that influential. And one of the points I want to make tonight is to say that the arts have always been this influential. It's only in our time that we've become so Philistinic that we don't appreciate the arts anymore. We think of them as something that belongs in a museum or something that's of no interest to us whatsoever. But if you look at the history of the 19th century, it's always the artists who lead this stuff. And when Napoleon goes to Austerlitz, he pulls off a masterpiece like a painter. It's one of the very few times in military history that everything he planned went exactly right. And he destroyed Emperor Alexander's army and the army of the Emperor of the Austrian Empire. But he was animated by this individualistic, very politically liberal notion. And we know this because Wagner was one of the revolutionaries in the revolutions of 1848, a wanted man, and later wound up marrying Liszt's daughter, and Liszt, even though he was only 2 years older than Wagner, became his father-in-law. These connections are not accidental, but they are sometimes invisible. So I mentioned that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. Amateurs will look at a battle map and say, well, I would have moved this division here, and I would have come over here, and I would. And the professional says, how are you going to get them there? One division's 3-day march away. One is out of water. One has no food. One is only a paper division. Its strength is down by 50% because of casualties in previous battle. So how are you going to do that? And I mentioned that in writing, the same thing is also true. We talk sentence structure, design. Forget what it's about. We don't care what it's about. Any professional writer will tell you that people come up to you all the time and say, I've got a great story for you. And I say, I don't want to hear it. I can think of my own stories all by my little old self. Even in Hollywood, we have some Hollywood people here, and I've been privileged to work in that industry, the industry, for a long time now. Writers have a saying that, especially of movie critics, unless you've been in the room, the term being for when writers go in, meet with producers, or give a pitch, or something at which something will be decided, that is, in the room, unless you've been in the room, you don't know what you're talking about. And that the movie you see on the screen is something vastly different because it goes through such a transformative process from what you're talking about to the producers or your agents or whoever else is working on it. So it comes back to this notion of experience and how important that experience is, but also what came before. A lot of times in a movie pitch, if the producer or the studio executive is bright, and most of them are, they'll say, oh, that's like whatever, and they'll mention a movie. And you say, yes, and it's the old joke is it's Jaws meets Going My Way, or something like that. Which is a movie I'd like to write, actually. I think it'd be pretty funny. It would take place off the coast of Ireland, because we got plenty of sharks out there. So you have to know what you're talking about.